David Robert Mitchell, director and writer of It Follows, has been able to uniquely craft a successful indie horror film that asks the viewers to give the film their own meaning by leaving so many questions about the film unanswered. Mitchell intends for the film rather to be left up for interpretation. This right here is a valid example of post-structuralism and a showing of David Robert Mitchell's going against the concept of interpolation. In this video essay, we're going to explore how It Follows relates to the concepts of genre, representation, post-structuralism, auteur, and signification. Let's start with genre. It Follows is an atypical horror film because it plays against many of the traditional conventions of the horror genre. Much of the film takes place in well-lit places or even in broad daylight. This contrasts the typical dim-lit and nighttime settings of horror films. It Follows also contrasts many horror films by denying isolation. The protagonist, Jay, is able to have all her friends by her side throughout the film. Her friends believe her and want to help her fight the entity. Don't get me wrong, It Follows is still considered a horror film, and this is due to the film's suspenseful plot, open-ended ending, supernatural antagonist, haunting visual imagery, and eerie musical score. It Follows is a film that breaks genre norms, but David Robert Mitchell, as the film's auteur, did this intentionally. What were his intentions by doing this? Why were his stylistic choices made? These are more questions that viewers are encouraged to give thought to. Let's discuss auteur. Auteur can be defined as a filmmaker whose personal influence and artistic control over a movie are so great that the filmmaker is regarded as the author of the movie. David Robert Mitchell is a perfect example of this. As the film's writer and director, Mitchell holds full creative control of his film and therefore becomes the film's auteur. It Follows is based off a recurring dream that David Robert Mitchell had while growing up. Mitchell implements different elements into his film to build suspense in the way that he wants. His manipulation of the camera is one example of this. Mitchell is able to make it seem like something that viewers should anticipate is constantly right outside the frame. This builds suspense and is highly intentional. His vision for the film's unique imagery and storyline was executed so precisely and mirrors the terrifying dream that Mitchell had during his childhood. He had a beautiful and twisted vision as the writer and director and was able to create it as he wished for it to be seen with his artistic control and personal style. His choice to leave out elements that show viewers what kind of world or reality the characters live in was a purposeful choice. Mitchell wants the audience to bring their backgrounds and personal experience into viewing the film in order to help give it their own meaning. This leads us to our next concept, post-structuralism. Post-structuralist theory discusses how visual representation does more than just depict people in reality in a certain way, but rather allows for the viewer to define and control them. It Follows plays with this in that the film is very careful in controlling the reality that the viewers understand. You could argue that It Follows controls the reality and defines it by manipulating the film so that all viewers see is an undefined thing. I find this especially interesting since it inherently contradicts itself. It's an example of a dialectical relationship. While this idea is complex, I think it's an important one because it is vital to the film's critical success. We so often are able to tell and discuss what time period characters live in, where they are, and so on. This proves difficult in the movie It Follows, which is exactly what David Robert Mitchell wants. The technology in this film shows analog televisions in the same scenes as futuristic e-readers. Notably, the car where Jay had her initial sexual experience that gave her the curse is an old-fashioned vehicle. These are all interesting, yet what I find the most intriguing is the clothing that the characters wear. The clothing is rather odd and does not seem to be able to fit a certain time period or modern era. The nurses in the hospital scene are shown to be wearing candy striper nurse uniforms. Although this detail is subtle, it adds to the confusion of the world in which our characters live. Every viewer is able to interpret it as something different, and this itself is a notable thing. Through this sort of playing with the reality, Mitchell plays against the idea of interpolation. Interpolation is the process in which individuals acknowledge and respond to ideologies, thereby recognizing themselves as subjects. Post-structuralism ties to It Follows by allowing the viewers to decide the reality within the film and allowing it to remain subjective. The next concept we will discuss is representation. Representation in film relates to the sort of reality that exists in the context of the filmmaker and its viewers. The main idea or thing being represented in It Follows is the it representing an STD. Making this connection allows for the audience to think deeper about how and why STDs are terrifying and should be seen as such. Having sex didn't kill Jay off like how girls having sex in other horror films automatically gets them brutally murdered. Mitchell holds a different view on sex than it seems most horror directors and writers do. Mitchell states, Jay doesn't do anything wrong in the film. My read is just that sex is part of life. While things do go poorly for her after that, it's not because having sex is bad. You're able to survive in It Follows if you're very aware of your surroundings at all times. There's a cost to that, though, because that's not really living. Jay is faced with either passing the curse to someone else or taking her murder and passing it back to who gave her the curse. Both choices are morally wrong, and this allows us to gain sympathy for our protagonist. The representation in the film is very intriguing and makes the audience ask questions, which is exactly what Mitchell wishes to happen. Lastly, we will discuss signification. Signification can be used all throughout the film so the audience can read into the film and give things meaning. The way that the entity decides to present itself in different forms can be read into and given meaning by the audience. Depending on who sees it, the entity fluctuates and shows itself in a different way. An example of this is the entity presenting itself as family members such as parents. This causes some emotional turmoil for the protagonist, such as when the entity presents itself as her father during the swimming pool scene and she does not want to tell her friends. Also, the specific settings such as the school or park are settings that can be read by the audience as safe spaces, which are no longer safe for the protagonist. The film raises a lot of questions that viewers want answers to and simply asks the viewers to answer them for themselves. Overall, David Robert Mitchell, the film's auteur, has successfully crafted a scary film that leads viewers to questions that they themselves must answer and give meaning to. We discussed how It Follows relates to the concepts of genre, representation, post-structuralism, auteur, and signification, and how each relates to Mitchell asking the viewers to give the film meaning by answering the questions for themselves rather than letting the film answer it for them. That's all for now, and if you haven't seen the film yet, I highly suggest doing so. You won't be disappointed.